Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of North Coast Craftsmen. My name is Dalton. If you guys have been around this channel for very long, you should know exactly what we're going to be doing today. We are going to be pouring our river table. If you're new here, I suggest you subscribe, give me a comment, and a like. Let's get started. First things first, everyone, we need to get our forms set up and level before we do anything else. If they aren't level, the epoxy will not spread evenly throughout our wood. The next step is going to be placing 2x4s on the inside of our form to ensure that our cherry boards don't float to the top when we pour in our epoxy. So to do this, we have to place tape on the 2x4 wherever it could touch the epoxy. I run a piece of tape across the bottom, then a piece on each side, then one more on the bottom, making sure no raw wood shows through. Now, if you don't do this correctly, your 2x4 is going to become a nice decoration piece on your new bedside table. So tip number one, tape is cheap, epoxy is expensive, and 2x4s don't make very good decoration pieces on nightstands. Now, when you feel good about your tape job, place the board tape side down. I repeat, tape side down, and make sure your boards below are snug against the sides of your form. Then tighten your clamps. Now, the next step is going to repeat the exact same process on the other side of the form. Now, if you're doing two tables like I am, repeat the process on the next table. Now that our forms are level, our boards are clamped down, it's time for the fun part to begin. For this pour, I will be using Epoxy's Flowcast. So because I've used this epoxy already, I decided to use measuring buckets versus dumping all of it into a 5-gallon pail. So I tried to get about half and half in each bucket, and it turned out to be about 3 liters in one and 2 3/4 liters in the other. I dumped the resin in first, then followed it up with the hardener and began mixing. So what I did here is I mixed for about 2.5 minutes in one bucket, then switched to the next bucket, mixed for about 2.5 minutes, and repeated the process until I got to 5 minutes of mixing in each bucket. I always mix my epoxy before I add pigment. This way that I know that my resin and hardener are both mixed together and I don't have any issues. So now that your epoxy is good and mixed, the next step is to add the pigment. I'm using a mixture of Black Diamond's Liberty Copper with a touch of Battleship Gray for this pour. Now you guys are probably wondering, well, how much pigment do I add to my epoxy? And the answer is, well, it depends. A general rule of thumb for adding pigment is if you want a translucent river, which means mostly see-through, you add about 1/4 teaspoon per liter. If you want a semi-translucent river, which means that you can see some of the wood edges, you add 1/2 teaspoon per liter. Now, if you want your river to be solid colored, then you add 3/4 teaspoon per liter. So I mixed up enough pigment to give myself a solid colored river, and I dumped half of the first bucket in one form and the other half in the other, and then I took the other bucket and dumped half into one form and half into the other. This is just in case there's a little bit of a variation in color between the two buckets. Then it mixes all together to create one color that's relatively equal and the same. So now at this point, all you basically have to do is make sure that all the nooks and crannies and cracks are filled with epoxy. Now, the one thing I did not mention that I did is after mixing my pigment, I let the 2 epoxy buckets sit for about 10 to 15 minutes to let all the air bubbles rise. Then I hit those air bubbles with a torch inside the bucket before I began my pour. So now all you have to do is basically wait for the air bubbles to rise and pop them with the torch and repeat the process. And now here's a little close-up view of what the table will look like immediately after your pour. So now here's what the table looks like after 24 hours in the form. All the patterns and figures you see are all natural. I did no swirling effects at all in this epoxy pour. I let the pigments do what the pigments wanted to do naturally. So if you think I've earned it, subscribe and like. That way when I take these river tables out of the form next week, you won't miss out. Thanks for watching. See you next week.